Good morning and afternoon, everyone. My name is Aaron Gorell, and welcome to our 1734th Justice Clearinghouse webinar, Value, Validation, and Venturing Forward with Virtual Comparison Microscopy. During our webinar this morning, Kathy Geil and Ron Nichols will explore three-dimensional virtual comparison microscopy as an emerging tool for firearms and toolmark examiners. They'll examine its value in adding objective quantitative data to bullet and cartridge case comparisons, address the validation concerns that come with deploying any new forensic technology, and lay out a path forward for integrating VCM into operational workflows. Kathy Geil is a forensic scientist with more than 2 decades of experience, having worked for the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab and several other accredited labs. Kathy is currently contracting with Leads Online as a technical advisor. And she's also a co-founder of Sandstone Forensics, where she provides casework training and research support in firearm and toolmark examination. Ron Nichols is the founder of Nichols Forensic Science Consulting and brings more than 30 years of experience as a firearm and toolmark examiner at local and federal levels. He's a distinguished member of the AFTE, a fellow of the American Academy of Forensic Science, and the author of Firearm and Toolmark Identification, the Scientific Reliability of Forensic Science Discipline. So, Ron Nichols pre-recorded his portion of today's webinar because he anticipated and is unfortunately currently stuck on a delayed flight. Now, I do want to extend a special thanks to our friends and partners for making this presentation possible. Today's webinar is done in partnership with Leads Online. Leads Online equips law enforcement agencies worldwide with critical crime-solving technology. The company's suite of investigative solutions includes data analysis and ballistic tools to help advance cases faster. The last couple of things I wanted to address with everyone is some basic housekeeping items. First, this event is being recorded and the formal presentation is scheduled to last about 60 minutes. It'll be available to members on the Justice Clearinghouse website. Second, this is a listen-only event, but you can type in any questions you have for Kathy through the Zoom toolbar, and she'll take as many of those questions as possible at the end of the formal presentation. Now, of course, given the remote nature of webinars, Kathy's not going to be able to read your body language, so feel free to use the emojis in the React area on the Zoom toolbar to provide feedback and let her know how you're feeling about the information she's sharing. Finally, after today's webinar, there will be a follow-up survey, and we ask that you complete it. Your feedback is shared with our presenters and helps shape everything we do here at Justice Clearinghouse. With that, I'll go ahead and turn the presentation over to our instructor for this morning. Kathy, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Aaron. I really appreciate it. And Ron does send his apologies, but air travel these days, you know? So just for the sake of the fact that microscopy is a tough word, I'll be saying VCM for the tongue twister that is virtual comparison microscope. See, right? It's terrible. All right. So is it? All right. So the objectives for today for this webinar are we're going to discuss the value of VCM, discuss some of the validation concerns for bringing VCM into your agency or laboratory, and things to keep in mind as we venture forward using VCM in our workplace. Here's our first polling question, Aaron.
Awesome. Opening that now. The question is, do you currently utilize virtual comparison microscopy, VCM, at your agency? And we'll give everyone just about another 5 to 10 seconds to respond here so we can get back to Kathy and the material from her and Ron. This is really interesting, Kathy. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. A little less than half of the audience said no, but they're thinking about it. 31% said yes, they currently do, and 24% indicated no. Back to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right, so here is Ron.
First thing that we want to consider is that virtual comparison microscopy is a value add to the current capabilities of the forensic firearms laboratory. There are several different capabilities, and what we want to do is discuss the capability as well as what it looks like with light comparison microscopy, and then what that looks like with virtual comparison microscopy. So, objectivity. With light comparison microscopy, we have a subjective visual assessment and interpretation. If you've taken enough of my training, you know that the correspondence of individual characteristics is an objective observation. And at the same time, the interpretation of that correspondence that we're viewing is a subjective assessment. With virtual comparison microscopy, there's a quantifiable 3D surface metrics that we can access. And with quantum in particular, what we can see is a clear separation between known different source and known same source comparisons, so that we have the quantifiable data that helps to support the conclusions that we're reaching. With respect to reproducibility, light comparison microscopy, although it's not impossible, it is more difficult to standardize. With virtual comparison microscopy, we can validate it and have validated repeatable digital measurements. With respect to data sharing, well, for light comparison microscopy, the physical evidence must be shipped. It's possible to make resin replicas of that evidence, but regardless, physical evidence or physical replicas must be shipped. With virtual comparison microscopy, there can be instant digital sharing across laboratories. And this can be beneficial for a laboratory system that is located in different locations within a particular state. With respect to documentation, for light comparison microscopy, we have the photographs, 2D static images only. For virtual comparison microscopy, we have permanent three-dimensional topography records. And then we can also have comparison images as well. So there's a lot of data that we can capture and document with virtual comparison microscopy. The courtroom strength. For light comparison microscopy, we know the challenges that we're facing with respects to Daubert and Frye challenges. We've been successful in so many of them, and at the same time, the courts are looking for some sort of statistical measurable data that they can look at. And virtual comparison microscopy does provide that. It supports a statistical and measurable evidence. And then finally, workflow efficiency. Light comparison microscopy is manual and it can be slower, especially when there's lots of data to compare. With virtual comparison microscopy, we have high volume scanning and digital triage. Virtual comparison microscopy can compare 20 cartridge cases in a few minutes, whereas for light comparison microscopy, it would take much more time to go through that process.
All right. So when bringing on these VCM technology, whether it be the Leads Online quantum system, the Cadre system, or the Leads Precision microscope, the Evo Finder, you want to make sure you have a solid validation plan to bring on these new technologies. So in review of the ISO 17025, the standard is the laboratory shall validate non-standard methods, laboratory developed methods, and standard methods used outside their intended scope or otherwise modified. The validation should be extensive as it is necessary to meet the needs of the given application or field of application. So to summarize, or in other words, the validation must be fit for purpose and consistent with or better than the current laboratory methods. However, let's keep in mind that this should be outcome-based and it's not a comparison or direct comparison to other previous methods. So VCM is not a direct replacement for the traditional light microscope, but rather additive. So let's also review verification versus validation. So if your agency or laboratory might not need a full validation, it may only require a verification depending upon the scope of your use of that technology. So again, ISO says for verification, the laboratory shall verify that it can properly perform methods before introducing them by ensuring that it can achieve the acquired performance. Records of the verification shall be retained if the method is revised if the method is revised by the issuing body, verification shall be repeated to the extent necessary. So this is one of the sections in ISO 17025. So in summary, a standard method in the field just needs a verification, but a non-standard method in the field needs validation. So things to consider with the validation? ISO has a list A through E of things that need to be included in your validation plan. The validation procedures used, specifications of the requirement, determination of the performance characteristics of the method, results obtained, a statement of the validity of the method detailing its fitness for the intended use. And what are the things that need to be recording for the validation of this test methods include, amongst others, needs to be determined as appropriate. So the sensitivity of the methods, the specificity of the method, the limit of detection, accuracy, precision, reliability or repeatability, reproducibility, if there isn't a measurement of uncertainty, to include that, as well as the false positive rate and false negative rate. So I would consider doing these validation in phases, where you're not bringing the system on and utilizing all of its capabilities, but rather a stepwise adoption of this new technology. And I've seen some other labs do this and with great success. So maybe a phase one where it's just acquisitions, getting people used to putting things into VCM as a databasing type format. Phase two, actually using those acquisitions to do VCM or microscopic comparisons of your acquisitions. Phase three, actually using the topographic metrics and some of the other measurable measures, that come with it, like similarity score, likelihood ratio, or false match rate. Keep in mind that the deployment validation needs to be simple. You're just demonstrating that it's fit for purpose, not completing a developmental validation or research on the technology, unless it's not available. And then you might have to do a little bit of that, but the validation just needs to show that it's fit for purpose and that it provides results as intended. For each of these phases, though, training is of the utmost importance. I've seen a lot of validations fail because the validation participants aren't completely trained on how to use the technology for the purpose in which you would like to use the technology. So confirm that your users understand and conform the tasks that you are requiring them to complete. So one of the things that I strongly suggest is doing a pilot study. So figuring out what fit for purpose means to you. One example of a type of pilot study is to have, say, 5 mock cases, complete them with the light microscope, traditionally like you have done in the past, and then also using a VCM technology and comparing those two, or looking at that VCM and was it helpful? Add it to your workflow. Did it give you any additive to your source determination opinion? Did it warrant these outcomes? Did they warrant bringing on this new technology? And you can request a demonstration or have this technology brought in by the vendor and being able to utilize it. This will really help you develop your validation plan and make sure that you have the understanding of that technology to really write a comprehensive plan so that you know what your fit for purpose is. I've put together a list of resources as I've been deep diving into this world, and I have a list for you here, but please don't jot these down. There should be, and I'm hoping Erin will help us figure it out if you haven't, where the link is to a handout. I want to say it's like 2.5 pages long of just different resources for the validation process. One I'd also like to bring is a free service that the ASCLD Association of Crime Lab Directors have of validation and evaluation repository. So if you click on that, or you go to their website and click on that, is a list of different validations, not just in the firearms field, but throughout forensic science departments or sections. And you can kind of see how validation plans are put together and pick and choose what's best for you and your processes. Here's our next polling question, Aaron.
Okay, and just so you know, I did drop the link for those resources into chat, so everyone should be able to grab those. And I'm going to go ahead and launch that poll. All right, the question is what capabilities interest your agency regarding virtual comparison microscopy? And please do click all that applies so you can select more than one. All right, and we'll give everyone about another 10 seconds. I know this one requires some time to scroll through and figure out what options are the best for you. And Kathy, when I finish sharing the poll, I'm just going to go ahead and show the results so you can see it. Would love for any kind of comments or feedback from you on the various techniques if we could.
Sounds great.
Super. All right, we got a majority of audience participating. Here are those results. So you can see almost 3/4 of you indicated objective comparison data and 67% indicated image quality for side by side. Anything else that you draw from this, Kathy?
No, it's great to see all the different agencies and their different aspects of VCM and knowing how wide ranging it all is, and that they can the different ways of using this. So no, it's great because I see that pretty much everybody has considered some aspects of VCM and integrating that into their laboratory. And I'm sure there is a lot more that I didn't even come up with. And that's what I'm really looking forward to as we start integrating VCM technology into our labs more and more. I know we all started talking about this in 2008, 2009 is so long ago. But I think the technology and the imaging has really advanced, and I'm excited to see it happening more in our labs. So this is great. Thank you so much. All right, here's Ron again.
It is important that this be viewed as just another instrument, but as a fundamental shift in workflow, documentation, validation, and courtroom strategies. The laboratories that succeed are those that anticipate the operational, scientific, and legal implications of virtual comparison microscopy early. When we're looking at venturing forward beyond validation, one of the things that we have to look at is examiner competency and training. And this is training on 3D interpretation because as we embrace more 3D technology, more data will impact the examiner. It's important to understand and remember that our identification criteria is built on a data set that we have acquired using standard light comparison microscopy. When we're looking at virtual comparison microscopy, we are going to have more data, and more data can impact our criteria for identification. So it is important to receive appropriate training in the interpretation of the data that we're viewing, and to be able to have some sort of calibration of our identification criteria from light comparison microscopy to virtual comparison microscopy. In addition, it's going to be important to understand the quantitative aspects of the algorithm. We're going to have to know basically how it works and what it is trying to demonstrate. And then proficiency training, which is specific to VCM. Not only a means of evaluating the correspondence in known matching and known non-matching scenarios, but also actual proficiency testing as well, focused on virtual comparison microscopy. And then when we're looking at the digital evidence management, We have to consider such things as long-term storage. What are these going to look like? Chain of custody, metadata preservation. What are the backup and disaster recovery plans? Many laboratories have different systems in which photographs have generally been imported. How are these going to be managed as we move into virtual comparison microscopy? Because the different systems have different ways of documenting certain things. And then security, integrity, and access control. We have to look at tamper detection. We have to consider audit logs and encryption issues. We need to consider controlled access for casework versus verification. And we should have policies in place for remote collaboration, not only between laboratories of the same laboratory system, but also different laboratories. Because this is a wonderful instance now where single examiner laboratories can have potential verification from another single examiner laboratory. But how are we going to manage that? And then there's legal and courtroom considerations. What's the Dauber-Frye readiness for virtual comparison microscopy? How good is your ability to explain virtual comparison microscopy to a jury? We're going to have to go through that process of learning how to clearly articulate not only what VCM is, but also a clear articulation between what is measured versus what is visualized. And then what is the documentation going to be of decision making? What are the algorithm limitations? As an example, there are some algorithms, and we've known this from machine-based studies. There are some algorithms in which the similarity score was low, and at the same time, there was still enough data within those tool marks to make an identification. For a trained examiner to make an identification, that is. So we have to understand what are the algorithm limitations and how are we going to explain that. Because if we're calling something an identification and the algorithm itself shows a low similarity score, how are we going to resolve that internally? And then how are we going to resolve that for the courtroom? And then there's workflow integration and change management. There's going to be potential bottlenecks, and we have to identify what those are going to be. We have to consider interoperability with existing systems, including our LIMS. There also has to be a consideration for remote peer review. What is that going to look like? And then hybrid workflows, because there are some things that virtual comparison microscopy just won't handle, or not handle as well, or not handle as efficiently maybe as light comparison microscopy. The thing that stands out to me is one thing that we emphasize in our training. Chamber marks on the side of cartridge cases. Those are really good marks because we know that chamber marks are not going to be influenced by subclass characteristics. And at the same time, that means we still have to have some light comparison microscopy. And that also means that VCM can still handle the breech face and the firing pin and the bullets, but what is that hybrid workflow going to look like? And how are we going to manage that? And then let's go back to the examiner. We started this discussion with the examiner. So now let's go back and look at the examiner again, because there can be a cognitive bias with respect to examiner decision making. Is there going to be an over-reliance on similarity scores or visual overlays? For example, when we're pulling up a comparison that has a really high similarity score, are we just going to buzz through that comparison? Or if we pull up a comparison that has a relatively low similarity score, are we going to be focused enough to be able to discern whether or not there's actual similarity there or not? So this over-reliance on similarity scores can create a cognitive or a confirmation bias, because there can also be a bias from digital enhancements. How are we going to, we know that virtual comparison microscopy, we can tinker with those images and we can expand them, We can change the lighting. We can change the various elements of the acquisition so that we can highlight particular data points. So is there going to be a bias when that is occurring as well? There likely will be an increased need for blind verification. Of course, it's going to be easier to manage a blind verification in this case. Not only that, but we would be able to measure repeatability and reproducibility as well. Because what we can do is when we're doing quality control checks, we can actually change the name of the image. There's lots of different things that we can do to hide the fact that this was pretty much the same images or image sets that the examiner may have looked at 6 months ago. So what we can do is we can mask a lot so that leaves the opportunity open for blind verification. And at the same time, it is a good measure of repeatability and reproducibility because we can annotate what we're looking at to make our decision, whether it be for an identification, elimination, or inconclusive. One of the things that really must be considered, though, is VCM must support and not replace examiner judgment. The current algorithms are very strong, and at the same time, they are not without their limitations. Throughout the history of machine-based work and machine-based studies, and I've looked at a lot of them, there has been a significant overlap in which there are same source samples that score really low among the data sets for the known different samples. And when we have pulled those images up, we can find enough support and enough correspondence for an identification. Of course, now we may begin to question, is my criteria for identification stringent enough given the similarity scores that I'm seeing? But remember, when we're looking at the similarity scores, they're looking at different elements of whatever that image is. So there can be different ways of interpreting the way the algorithm interprets the entirety of that image or that measurement. So it's going to be really important to really understand what's happening with the algorithm. And again, VCM must support and not replace examiner judgment in these instances. So that's how we venture forward beyond verification. There's going to be a lot involved. And again, there's not only laboratory issues that are going to have to be considered, but there are examiner issues that are going to have to be considered as well. And that's why it's important. One of the things I've always thought once I retired from ATF and once I ventured into the private consultation, if you will, I was moving into that area where there has to be a bridge between light comparison microscopy and virtual comparison microscopy for the firearm examiner. And I do believe that it is as important for the trained firearm examiner to calibrate that criteria for identification by looking at known different source data as well as known same source data and seeing what that looks like on a virtual comparison microscope. It is really important to calibrate our identification criteria. We're looking at far more data than we've ever seen before. And it's important to acknowledge that, respect that, and understand that proper training can help deal with that. It is important that it is important.
All right, thank you so much. Here is both Ron and myself's contact information, if you'd like to contact us. And we are ready for questions. I see there's some in the chat.
There are, Kathy. Thank you so much for a great presentation. Ron, thank you as well. Ron must have just gotten off his flight because I'm able to see that he has joined us. It is by phone only. So Ron, are you there?
I am.
Oh, fantastic. Well, Kathy did an amazing job, and thank you so much for pre-recording that for us.
Oh, you're welcome.
Great. Well, let's dive right into the questions there. The first one goes to Kristen. Kristen wanted to know, do you know of anyone who's used VCM and testified in court about it?
Not current myself. No, I have not. I do know that many laboratories are gearing up. The one laboratory that may have is the Houston Forensic Science Center, because I do know that they've been running VCM for quite a while.
Yes, and I think there is, it's one of the Carolinas, and I'm gonna screw it up. Sarah, I think, has gone. I don't know if she is on she probably can't speak, but yes, I believe that and Arizona labs have gone to court with VCM. So I don't know in what capacity. Has it gone all the way to comparison, or was it databasing only? But yes, people have been using VCM and been going to court with it.
Outstanding. Okay. And Sarah, let me know, just text me if you wanted to kind of weigh in on that, and I can allow you to talk here. Next question goes to Catherine. How does an examiner rectify a low similarity score even though there's sufficient agreement for identification by a trained examiner? We've seen this quite a bit in our validation study.
I can manage that question as well. The it's important to understand what the algorithm is doing. As an example, is it a because we have a particular band that the algorithm is assessing. And for myself, when I've looked at quantum as an example, I've had several instances in which the FMR was rather low, and still there was enough data there to make the identification. So all I would do is discuss that in court, because there are limitations to the algorithm, because the algorithm is looking at the entire image when the entire image may not have sufficient data. And so what data is present, though, is aligning and corresponding. So that's how I would resolve that. It would be more difficult, but it's not nearly impossible to navigate that.
Fantastic. I wanted to share a comment from an audience member, Melissa. Melissa says Houston is still validating our VCM, but I know the FBI and others have testified in court regarding VCM. So hopefully that fills in some of the gaps here. Okay, Ron, I know that you answered this through chat, but question from Eric: would remote peer review be obtainable if labs were using different industry systems?
They would be. You would just have to export the files as XP3 files. So long as the different systems are capable of reading XP3, you should be able to accomplish that.
Great. And then Caitlin asks, what workflow process would you suggest for VCM with regular light microscopy?
Kathy, you want to take that one?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So obviously there's lots of different ways you can do that workflow. How I've seen it done and in my own personal thoughts and feelings on it would be to use them in tandem, depending upon the case. So having everything scanned in VCM, and then if I need to, or if I want to perform, I'll probably start, because I'm an older examiner, experienced, I guess I should say, not old, but experienced examiner using light microscope for quite some time. Obviously, that is my comfort zone. But as I reach an inconclusive, or if I'm having difficulties with indexing, bringing on VCM to help me readily index bullets or cartridge case. But I can also see it where I would start with VCM, do the microscopic comparison, and then go to the light microscope to say, yes, I see that those same marks. And initially, I think how I start using VCM is going to change as my comfort level, and as Ron, you were alluding to, how you train yourself for how do you discern the level of correspondence that's needed for source determination. So not necessarily just jumping straight to a similarity score, but using it to enhance what we see under the light microscope with the not glare and being able to document that. So I see them happening actually in tandem where I can utilize both.
Wonderful.
And then,
Oh, go ahead.
sorry,
I'm sorry.
Sarah, Georgia. For some reason, I always put you in the Carolinas. I don't know why. Maybe because it's close. Thank you, Susan.
Fantastic. So Sarah did indicate we require VCM if LCM is inconclusive and vice versa. Okay, a few more questions here. How far along are the studies for likelihood ratios or statistical probabilities?
Well, I can't speak to Cadre or EvoFinder. All I can do is speak to Quantum. Quantum has developed a very rigorous quantitative measurement that has been working very well. They've spent many years validating that with different comparisons. And what they've done with that is actually they've developed that algorithm so that it is caliber independent. So you would be able to reach out to leads online to discuss with them the validation that they put together. And Kathy may be able to speak more to that with respect to the algorithm and false match rate index. I don't know if they're working on a likelihood ratio, but, and again, I don't know about EvoFinder or Cadre, but I know that Quantum is pretty well established with respect to that.
All right. Next question goes to Catherine. Do you include scores in your reports and notes routinely or only when they're over a certain threshold? Cadre, for example, calls scores under a certain threshold as inconclusive.
So I would include the score if I'm going to use it all the time. And if anything, just for trending purposes. I may not report out the score just yet, as we haven't really quite discerned how it's going to, like Ron was speaking to earlier, if you have a low score, but you have a source determination, how we're going to discern those and discuss with that. But I would retain that score just like I do with, say, a NIBIN score. I keep the correlation results so that quality control system and the I have them for trending purposes of like, hey, I made this ID, the source determination. What was my score then for this type of firearm or this type of mark or sets of marks? So I always record the score and the data for references at least. And then once we get more understanding and more use of it in court, be able to then report that out on a formal report.
Okay, next question goes to Sarah. Sarah asks, have there been successful validations of any of the algorithms to be able to use as support in conclusions? And she said Quantum versus Cadre versus Evo.
Didn't we answer that question? Because what I discussed with Quantum is that they did some very rigorous work. In fact, the algorithm is caliber independent for their bullets at this point. And I can't speak to Cadre or EvoFinder, unfortunately, but Cadre has done some very rigorous work with respect to the validation. It's been published, and it is available in the published literature. And you can also probably reach out to Leads Online for more information with respect to that.
Great. And then our last couple of questions go to Laura. Laura asks, do you know how many organizations are using consecutively manufactured sets for training examiners on using VCM or as part of the validation?
I don't know with respect to individual laboratories. I do know that we offer a advanced training course for virtual comparison microscopy, and the samples within that not only have consecutively manufactured or bullets and cartridge cases using consecutively manufactured parts, but in addition, they're using samples from same make and model as well. So it's a diverse set of samples that are used for that training. More rigorously, the training is focused on those samples that would have low FMR scores. So it will really challenge the examiner in terms of what they're looking at in terms of correspondence and seeing how well their particular conclusions link to the correlation scores that are being done. There are plenty of opportunities to obtain consecutively manufactured samples, and that would be a good way to do that.
Okay, we've got a couple other questions that just dropped in. Next one is, if the traditional light microscopy is inconclusive, but the VCM has high confidence score, is it the expectation to report out an identification based on the VCM?
Kathy, you want to take that one?
I don't know. I don't know about that one. That is tough because I think that's as we're bringing on this new technology, that's one of the core questions, right? We have the traditional light microscope that, has over, 125 years or so of research and experience and utilization in our field. If you would get a high score, in VCM, but yet we can't view that in the light microscope version or in the topographic readings or the visualization that we get. You got me stumped. I don't know that I would make that source determination without seeing the pattern matching. And I would deep dive into how is it arriving at that score. I have yet to see that example in my examination of this new technology. And I think when we see that, I've seen the opposite with a low score, but correspondence with the pattern matching, but I haven't seen it the other way around. So I don't think I would call a source determination just on a score. I think I'd want that visual backup. What do you think, Ron?
You definitely want the visual. You want the visualization there. And for me, the score would be a backup to that. And the score is support for that. I have not seen an instance. I've worked a lot with quantum, actually. I've worked a lot with quantum with consecutively manufactured bullets. I've worked a lot with consecutively manufactured breech bases and firing pins. So I've done a lot of work with quantum, and I have not seen one instance where there's been a high score and no pattern correspondence.
Right.
Okay. And then our last question goes to Faisal. How can an examiner be confident that the image accurately represents the physical surface of the cartridge case or bullet and that no distortion was introduced during the scanning process?
That would be based on the technology that you're getting and the assurance, because I know quantum has a built-in system that calibrates that to ensure that the image is a true representation of the topographical features of that cartridge case or bullet. So you would have to reach out to the manufacturer for a determination on how they do that.
You can also, to add to that, having both systems, a light microscope and a virtual comparison microscope, side by side, where you can review what you're getting topographically and then looking at that under the light microscope to see that what is represented. You are obviously with virtual, you are having resolution limitations. There is stretching, there is things just inherent in doing this type of imaging to gather these, the virtual comparison. So like Ron said, you would just talk to the manufacturer upon that and understand the limitations of that system and how it actually reads the surface features of that cartridge case or bullet that you're scanning.
Okay. Next question from Catherine is specific to quantum. Catherine asks, can you use LRs if the population database is not necessarily representative of the types of firearms seen in a specific region?
Kathy, do you know if Quantum is currently using LRs? Because I'm not aware that they are.
I don't think they're using likelihood ratios. Where I think people are starting to look at this because I believe it's NIST it's called Rapid Fit? Correct me if I'm wrong. Where you can send in your scan, your XP3 file, and they will compare it to a population. I don't think it's released yet, but it's coming. I'm hoping to have an update here at our meeting for AFTI. But I think it's going to be a totality, not regional. So that'll be interesting to see if there is that capability to see, does that change your likelihood ratio from the population of your area? But again, you would have to confirm that that firearm wasn't. There's a lot to that question. It wasn't brought in, say someone drove it from another population. So I'm not quite sure. That would be some really interesting research. I'm really excited. And Miss Catherine, I think you should probably do that. I would love to see that more.
And I would also add that the article that was published by Roberge and the other guys, they do comment as to why they use the FMR as opposed to a likelihood ratio. So, and they developed that really well. So that's a really good article to access. And I know it can be accessed through the Leads Online site.
Great.
Great suggestion, Ron.
All right. We have a couple more questions that have come in. Ilias asks, how do algorithms determine the threshold for falling inconclusive?
The bottom line is for any VCM, especially currently, the examiner has to decide whether or not it's inconclusive or not. The score is simply there to support it. We should not be basing any common source conclusions, inconclusives, or eliminations based simply on the score. The bottom line is we're still doing pattern examination, pattern comparison, pattern analysis. The score supports what we're doing, and it's not the other way around. So there are certain thresholds that, as an example, there in the Rebel graph, there is a diagonal line at the 1 in 10,000, and people have misinterpreted that as the go, no-go line. What that line is basically is anything that falls below that line has been generally looked at by an examiner and may not have enough data for a common source conclusion. FMR scores above that line generally did have enough data for an examiner to make an identification on a light comparison microscope. So I wouldn't say it's arbitrary. At the same time, those FMR scores, whatever scores you're using, are simply support for a conclusion that has been reached by doing standard pattern comparison microscopy. Now, when you do it on a VCM, it's a heck of a lot easier because it's going to line you up in the spot you need to be at. And there's going to be a lot of automation with respect to that. It's basically AI guiding you to the best phase spots. We still have our responsibility as an examiner to make the call. And that score does little more than back it up.
Okay, then Sarah is asking whether or not anyone is specifying in their reporting that VCM was used versus LCM.
And that would be a good question for the group.
Yes, I don't know. I would imagine that some organizations, as a part of their quality management system, have to list the methods used. So I would think so. And as part of transparency, if you have multiple technologies, I might list that as well. So
I
Sarah,
would
if
say
you're doing it, we'll probably just follow you.
from a quality standpoint, you should be specifying which method you use.
Yeah,
Yeah.
agreed.
So,
And Sarah did add that they are required to at their lab, and she was just curious what other folks are doing. Ron, Kathy, that's the end of the questions. To our audience, thank you so much for asking amazing questions. Any closing comments? Maybe we can start with you, Kathy, and then end with Ron.
No, I just really appreciate you letting us present today and thank you for all the great questions, everyone.
thanks for the opportunity to present. There is an article in the FT Journal that Dr. Green and I co-authored, where it talks about the FMR, it talks about low FMR scores and separation of of known match and known non-match conditions, especially for poorly marked bullets. So I would recommend that you take a look at that, because all the information in there was based on consecutively rifled bullets. In fact, two of the sets were consecutively broach sized and broach rifled. So the land surfaces on those barrels had a potential for subclass characteristics, and that study clearly shows that they weren't showing up.
All right. Well, folks, you have just a couple more seconds to get down the contact information for Kathy and Ron. Ron, Kathy, again, thank you so much. Thank you to Leads Online for making this presentation possible. And with that, this concludes this morning's Justice Clearinghouse webinar. Take care, everyone, and please stay safe.
Thank
Bye
you
now.
all.